Good morning, everyone. I ask forgiveness to my elders for anything that I might mispronounce. I'm still learning my language. Osta, Sanalehi, Anawage Rose, Dakwadua, Chidilagi, Muskogee, Oklahoma Policy Institute, Dagila Wistini. Good morning. My name is Anawake Rose. I am the Executive Director of the Oklahoma Policy Institute. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and also of Muskogee descent. Thank you for joining us today as we launch our new paper, A Better Path Forward. Before I get started, I want to thank our speakers today for sharing their knowledge and expertise. Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. of the Cherokee Nation, Labor Commissioner Leslie Osborne, Senator John Michael Montgomery of Lawton, and Dr. Cynthia Rogers of the University of Oklahoma. I also want to thank our board members for trusting us as we launched into this new endeavor. And to the entire team of the Oklahoma Policy Institute, I am constantly humbled to work with you. Your expertise makes the work that we do, including this event, look easy. Thank you. And thank you to our valued friends, donors, supporters, and all the many Oklahomans that are watching at home today via our live stream. Your ongoing support has enabled us to continue to do the work that we do. And thank you to the staff here at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum for your assistance. We really appreciate all you've done to make this event as smooth as possible. The Oklahoma Policy Institute was created 12 years ago to be able to provide nonpartisan analysis of our state's laws and policies. From the beginning, we have had particular expertise in budget and tax issues. Thanks in large measure to the experienced staff like my colleagues, Paul Shin, who will be providing an overview in just a few minutes, and Emma Morris, who will be participating in our panel discussion a little later on. Our focus on budget and tax matters is vital because our state and the taxes that fund it are the lifeblood to all government operations. Most especially, our budget and tax systems make possible the shared programs that Oklahomans rely on for everyday life. Anyone who has watched politics in Oklahoma recently knows full well that our state budget is vulnerable to market forces, particularly from the petroleum industry. We also know that shrinking budgets have put a squeeze on essential services such as education, as you may recall from the 2018 teacher and parent protests at the Capitol. But it doesn't have to be this way. That's why OK Policy is today releasing our latest report, A Better Path Forward. This comprehensive analysis takes a look at the state's budget and tax systems. It shows us where we are now, how we got into this situation, what implications are for the decisions we've made, and most importantly, it examines potential solutions that will shore up state revenue while making our tax system fairer for everyone. The report contains more than 30 potential budget and tax reforms for taxpayers and lawmakers to consider. We have described this report as a roadmap. As any traveler knows, a map doesn't dictate your path. It only shows the possible routes a traveler can take along their way to their final destination. In much the same way, we are not saying that these are definitive solutions to address Oklahoma's budget and tax deficiencies, but it does show a way that we can move forward. Through the publishing of this report, we seek to stimulate a public conversation about how Oklahoma can strengthen state revenue, how it can provide essential public services, how we can level the playing field along racial and economic lines, and how Oklahoma can make meaningful investments in our future success. Now, to kick off today's program, I'd like to welcome our moderator for today. When we were first planning this event, we knew we wanted to have a respected voice who would be able to help lead today's discussion and MC our event. Our first and only call was to Trace Savage, who is a longtime Capitol observer. Trace is the editor-in-chief for NonDoc, an independent online news organization that launched in September 2015. Please join me in welcoming Trace.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rosa. Flattery will get you everywhere, particularly with the wonderful, thoughtful people at the Oklahoma State Capitol. See what I did there? Okay. I just wanted to welcome everybody for being here. Thank you so much to everybody who will participate and for the invitation to this and the work that Oklahoma Policy does. Quick notes about the program today. We're going to start with an overview from one of the co-authors of the new report, Mr. Paul Shin. Look forward to hearing his work. I've read a lot of his work in the past. That'll be terrific. Immediately after, Labor Commissioner Leslie Osborne, former leader in the Oklahoma House of Representatives, will be offering a response. And then afterwards, she will go and inspect all the elevators in the National Cowboy Hall of Fame here. It'll always be the Cowboy Hall of Fame to me. There we go. A panel discussion will then ensue featuring Emma Morris from the Oklahoma Policy Institute, as well as Senator John Michael Montgomery from Lawton, Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin of the Cherokee Nation, and Dr. Cynthia Rogers from the University of Oklahoma. With that, then we will have a little bit of Q&A. With that, I want to introduce Paul Shin. He's going to tell us a little bit about the report being released today. He serves as the Tax and Budget Senior Policy Analyst for the Oklahoma Policy Institute, has been in that position since 2019, worked in higher education a long time before that here in Oklahoma, as well as in his home state of Oregon. Paul has a lot of great things to say, and I'm not going to take up any more time. Paul, would you like to come up here and provide that overview? Thanks so much. Give him a round of applause as well.
Thank you very much, Trace. Thank you, panelists, for joining us today. Commissioner, thank you particularly. Members of the media and my amazing colleagues at OK Policy. Thank you for being here. It's great to see y'all. A lot of the time when we talk about budget and tax, we talk about politics and we talk about small events. This year's budget, who wants what? Who wants something different? Instead, what we've done with this document is we've looked at not short-term politics, but long-term governance. What do all of these decisions that seem small and partisan result in? So, but a better path forward is a 30,000-foot level look at the changes that we've made over time and their impacts, followed by a discussion of what the next couple of decades could look like. And again, not what it has to look like, what it could look like. Here's our argument in 3 sentences. We've cut our taxes and public services too much to the detriment of Oklahoma's health, safety, and prosperity. We've shifted the responsibility to pay taxes from those who can most afford it to those who can least afford it. And we can do better. And let's start off with how we think we can do better. We're offering not a plan, but a menu of options for discussion now and well into the future. For context, it's important to remember these 2 things. Cutting taxes, public services, and fairness isn't making Oklahoma a top 10 state. And while this is 30 options, how many $1 trillion is that? Everything, if we were to do everything amongst those 30 options, the tax increases in Oklahoma would be about $1.25 billion, $1.25 billion. That is barely half of the $2.1 billion of tax cuts that we've made in the last 30 years. Our options fall under these broad groupings. First, require those who have benefited the most from tax cuts to pay their fair share through higher top income tax rates, ending itemized deductions to the income tax, eliminating the capital gains deduction, and similar items. Second, modernize the sales tax base. This tax is antiquated, and it's the main source of unfairness in our tax structure. When we tax goods but not services, it hurts those with lower incomes and helps those with higher incomes. Third, make taxes fairer for everyone by increasing income tax credits for low-income families. Fourth, make common sense structural changes, like funding our courts and police fully through appropriations rather than fines and fees that are holding back our citizens and our economy and really our ability to call ourselves a moral place. We also need to restructure State Question 640, which is keeping us from fixing mistakes that we make, or more typically for legislators, mistakes that our predecessors made. We need Oklahomans to make decisions on current needs, not on a vote that was 30 years ago. Finally, we need to get tax incentives under control, and we need to use the money we spend on incentives now to build better public services. Tax incentives are budgetary choices. We need to make more thoughtful choices and wiser choices going forward than we have looking backwards. Now we'll just give a real quick view of what led us, what facts and what history led us to these recommendations, options, this menu. Government is essential to do the things that we can't do on our own, in our own house or our own business. Educate our children, support our health, build infrastructure, make a better environment. And we've chosen to spend less and less and less over time on these essential functions that build a society and a community. Our state budget is 22% lower now than it was in fiscal year 2000 when you adjust for inflation and when you adjust for the population growth that we are enjoying. That means less funding means less services. And we've been continuously making the choice, less funding, less services. There are several reasons that this has happened. First, we have dramatically reduced the state income tax in Oklahoma. We've cut the top tax rate. We have expanded deductions and credits. We've expanded incentives, and we've expanded some really, really expensive total exemptions to the income tax. Let's talk a little bit more about tax exemptions, credits, and incentives. Right now, $4.4 billion every year, and $4.4 billion is almost exactly half the state current budget. We're not collecting that $4.4 billion because it's going to targeted tax expenditures. We call targeted tax expenditures anything that is claimed by less than 1 out of 10 Oklahomans. Those are costing $4.4 billion this year. They cost $500 million in 2010. Many incentives now cost more than 5 times what they did just 7 or 8 or 10 years ago. Third, State Question 640's supermajority vote requirement makes tax increases extremely difficult, and tax cuts, no questions asked. And tax cuts are always going to be more popular than tax increases, but tax increases are going to be required as well. So the shrinking budget and tax cuts are hurting our economy and our people and our future. Decades of research shows that $1 of public spending adds $1.50 to $2.50 of economic output. On the other hand, $1 of tax cuts adds 35 cents of economic output. And that ratio is more or less demonstrated in Oklahoma. Compared to the nation as a whole and to our neighbors, we've cut taxes and spending more than they have. Yet our economy isn't that much better. We've fallen since 1997 from 4th to the 6th highest tax rate among our 6 neighbors and us, but we're in 5th of the 7 in output, in jobs, and in income. 5th out of 7, just like we were in 1997. Our taxing system is not only insufficient to meet our needs, it's also unfair. It's regressive. Lower income Oklahomans pay a higher share of their income than high income Oklahomans do. And it's gotten more regressive over time. In fact, Oklahomans for people who make under $20,000 a year, we are the 5th highest tax state in the country. Here's how out of balance that tax structure is. A lot of people might like the idea of a proportional tax. Let's all pay exactly the same share of our income. In Oklahoma, that would be a hair under 11% of our income in state and local taxes. Those people who are making under $20,000, they would see a $310 tax cut. People making $1 million would have to pay $50,000 more per year under a proportional tax system. Regressive tax systems also expand racial inequities and gender inequities and geographic inequities because people of color tend to have lower incomes than white people. Single-headed households tend to have lower incomes than married households. Rural households tend to have lower income than urban households, and so each of those is paying some kind of tax penalty for being who they are or living where they live. And our tax structure does not just meet what economists call vertical equity, the more you pay, or the more you earn, the more you pay. It doesn't meet horizontal equity, which I like to think of as equal justice. That means if we have the same income, we ought to pay the same taxes. If we're equally able to pay taxes, we ought to pay the same taxes. And our tax code is just rife with violations of equal justice. Just a couple examples. Taxpayers for tax breaks available to homeowners aren't available to renters. Tax breaks available to high-income retirees aren't available to low-income workers with considerably lower incomes. So what should we do about this? Well, that's what the roadmap is doing, is trying to start and broaden a conversation in Oklahoma about what we can do about it. There isn't just one path forward, there are many paths. We've been locked into the same path in Oklahoma for too long, and to our detriment, and to the detriment of those who follow us. Our state's future depends on a public, inclusive, spirited, and productive debate about what we want Oklahoma to be. With this document, we're looking forward to engaging with those who share our love for our state and our dedication to making it the best place to live on this planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shin. With that, the Oklahoma Policy Institute told me when they were starting this day that they wanted to make sure they had a robust set of voices that offered different perspectives. And so they wanted to invite somebody who could maybe offer a response. And Labor Commissioner Leslie Osborne is going to do that now in just a second. Met Representative Osborne at the time. She spent 10 years in the Oklahoma House of Representatives representing, I believe, District 47 in Grady and Canadian counties. And she won her election to the Labor Commissioner post in 2018. She's finishing her first term there. You did a lot of things when you were in the legislature, helped pass the Pay for Success model that was funded by the Kaiser Family Foundation for Women in Recovery. Some other things that escape me right now, but most importantly, you had a lot of experience on subcommittees for appropriations, as well as a stint as the chairwoman of the House Appropriations and Budget Committee. So you're very familiar with this process, and you were heavily involved back in 2017 when things were really dire in the state of Oklahoma in terms of revenue. So without any further ado, Commissioner Osborne, if you can take it from here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. And I first want to thank the Policy Institute. When decision makers, in particular about our budget, are trying to make very difficult decisions, and we all know that there's only one constitutional duty of the legislature, and that is to pass a balanced budget by sine die, by the last Friday in May of every year. Now, sometimes they seem to get a bit off track and go into many different directions, but the main thing they have to do is fund state government. So thank you to the Policy Institute for the great data, the great resources. I don't think of it as, and I've heard some people say in the past, well, we have a liberal group out there and we have a conservative group out there. They both give us data. I believe these are the real numbers. I believe you can fact check that. And I think that it's always good to have more information. So thank you for what you all do. Of course, I've already read through the information. I see lots of things that would be very beneficial. I see some that are politically feasible and some that aren't. You have to know what's doable and what's not. We can all look at what would work best, but that doesn't mean it's politically feasible to get it through with the percentage of votes needed to actually get it through the legislature. Paul referenced State Question 640. We have the highest margin in the nation to raise taxes, but we can easily cut taxes without that same margin, which kind of makes a disconnect. When I talk about things like this, I like to talk about what really is the role of the state budget and government and the legislature. And to me, it's funding the fabric that allows a society to flourish and its citizens. So if you think about it, we're required to educate every child in all 77 counties with a quality public education. We need to have a good system of infrastructure to move goods and services, but also for our citizens to be safe in travel. We need to make sure that we are doing multiple other things, from public safety, highway patrol, to fire, to doing the things that are incumbent upon us to keep major medical systems in our rural counties in particular. The passage of Medicaid expansion is already showing a difference with that. We had lost, I believe, 12 major medical systems after not accepting those dollars the first year I was in the legislature, which was 2008-09. And then mental health care. I mean, we just are not doing enough. We're 48th in the nation in the amount of services available. And I promise you, there is no one in this room that has not seen someone in their family, in their workplace, in their friends that has been affected by mental health. It is absolutely as real as physical health. And for years, we wouldn't talk about that. Guys, we need to talk about that. My daughter was a counselor at Yukon Public Schools last year and had an average of one child a week that either tried to commit suicide or discussed the possibility in a 4th through 6th grade wealthy school district. If that was happening there, it's happening everywhere. When she dig deeper, it was, of course, a lot of the stress of the pandemic and a lot of the other things that go on, and family dysfunction bleeds down to our children. But the ability for her to be able to get services to those children was so lengthy, so cumbersome, so difficult that it's frustrating, because that's where we should be focusing. We are 27% of our population has a higher education degree. I mean, there's so many things we need to be pushing. And I always say that it's not, if we could have a better funded state to fund the things that change our trajectory, don't make it my agency. I have 80 employees. We are well funded. I'll ask for a flat budget again, John Michael. I have every year since I've been there. And my point is, there's 4 or 5 places, though, that if we would invest, we truly change the trajectory. And that's what we have to do. And if somebody could wave a magic wand and see that we were a bit better funded, start with the babies. You have to start somewhere. Envelop the children that are born today and their parents in how to be effective parents. Not everybody knows how to be a parent. Make sure we have quality daycare for those kids. Not everyone has a grandmother next door to watch the kids. We need to see that we're doing everything we can to start that next generation right. We pride ourselves in being very pro-life in Oklahoma, but I tend to say that we're really more pro-uterus or pro-womb, because we don't tend to want to do the services once the baby hits air. Guys, that's when it's every bit as much more important. Not everybody was taught how to be a good parent. That was one of the things I fell in love with at the Kaiser Foundation's Women in Recovery program, is that the vast majority of them, when reconnected with their children, were actually had parenting classes, things we take for granted: how to cook a healthy meal, how to check your kids' homework, how to do this, how to do that, how to limit screen time, things that we may take for granted, but not every family has learned. And if we can be that educational source to lower income families in particular, and envelop that child in the services that would change their future, I think we would see an amazing difference. I pulled up Wallet Hub this morning. Paul said he gave me some other numbers, but I just love Wallet Hub, a nonpartisan source that talks about overall tax burden. As of May of this year, which was prior to the tax cuts the legislature did, we were 44th in the nation in overall tax collections. You get what you pay for. If you are not investing, you're not flourishing. If we want to keep businesses here and bring new businesses in, it will not be by a lower tax rate when we're already 44th in the nation in overall tax burden. What it will be is that we would provide the people that moved here a good place for their employees to live, a good place for them to educate their children, a safe place to live. And nowhere is better than Oklahoma, but we are failing in investing. What I notice a lot at the Capitol is we use the excuse, well, we got back to 2018 levels, or, oh, we're doing this much better than we did last year. What we should be looking at when we're 44th in the nation in tax collections, and probably after the tax cuts that my colleagues in the legislature did this year, $280 million a year, they said that we didn't need. There's nothing else to invest in. I assume that'll get us back to 48th or 49th after next year. Guys, that's not acceptable. That is not acceptable. You get what you pay for. And when you are not investing in your state, when you're not investing in your citizens, do not be surprised when you're 45th to 50th in every indicator. That bright and beautiful daughter that I talked about a minute ago left this state to move to Colorado, where she could make twice as much in a school and where she could easily get the resources needed. I want to keep our best and brightest here. And our best and brightest, which many of you in this room, it will be your children and your grandchildren, will not stay here if they do not have the opportunities. And I don't want that to happen to you all like it happened to me. John Michael has a beautiful little girl that's what, 2? 3. Let's envelop John Michael's little girl in every advantage that lets her break glass ceilings, that lets her be the next rock star in her family, instead of letting people fall through the cracks. So in closing, thanks again to the Policy Institute. Remember that funding and investing in your state should never be a partisan issue. It should not be a Democrat-Republican issue. When I was fired as being the House Appropriations Chair because I was calling for tax increases, when we remember 49th, 50th in the nation, I was told by multiple people that that happened because I wasn't a good Republican. I like to say, yes, maybe I wasn't, but I think it made me a good Oklahoman. At some time, we have to take off the labels of native and non-native, of black and white, of how people love, of what their political party is, and start working together if we ever want to see this trajectory change. So thanks again to the Policy Institute.
Thank you, Commissioner Osborne. I hope somebody out there is writing that down. That's good stuff. Or interesting stuff, I should say. You two fight and I'll write about it. I want to invite a few people up here to participate in a quick policy panel discussion. And I'm going to introduce you. When I say your name, go ahead and come up and take your seat. First, I want to introduce Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr., first elected in 2019. He's had just a little bit of stuff on his plate over the last 2 years. So appreciate you being here and always being accessible to talk to. Senator John Michael Montgomery. Want to go ahead and have you come up here as well. A Republican representing Senate District 32 in Lawton. You joined the House of Representatives first. You're an OU graduate like myself. Chief, are you an OU person as well?
I am.
I think we might have an entire OU panel here. I'm not really sure. So that'll probably, we have to keep the labels somewhere, right, Commissioner? Dr. Cynthia Rogers, speaking of the University of Oklahoma, she's an economics professor and a Norman City Council rabble-rouser. If you get the chance to see her in action on Tuesday nights, it can be exciting. Thank you, Dr. Rogers, for being here. And then last but not least, Emma Morris with the Oklahoma Policy Institute, one of the co-authors of the report being discussed today. She is the Healthcare and Revenue Policy Analyst for the OK Policy Institute. And that's our panel right here. So we'll have a little, thank you, there we go. People are already sending me ridiculous screenshots of myself. I'm getting haircuts Saturday, trying to grow it out to look like Blake Shelton with maybe old school Blake Shelton. But without further ado, I wrote up some questions and I wanted to give everybody kind of a chance to answer every question that I have here. But I will start with sort of one individual person. And Dr. Rogers, you drew the short straw.
Oh, man.
Thank you for being here. Generally speaking, what is your biggest concern about the structure of Oklahoma's state budget?
Oh, thanks for the easy question.
There you go.
Well, first, thank you for inviting me to participate, and I very much appreciated the roadmap and the suggestions there. So, what was the question again?
What is your personal biggest concern with the structure of the Oklahoma state budget?
Yeah, it's broken. It just doesn't work. It doesn't. I'm an economist. I may be registered with one party or another, but when you're an economist and you look at cost benefit and you look at what investments in people and infrastructure and public health, which ones pay off in terms of a net benefit to a state, Oklahoma's failing to actually make smart policy choices. And I think part of it is we're not looking holistically at what works and how all the parts fit together. So I think it's just broken. I know that's not a particular thing, but
Well, that's
we are starving our essential core services. And, you know, a starvation diet means you die. And I think that's what we're seeing, some outcomes like that.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers. I'll just go down the line. Ms. Morris, well, same question to you. It's from looking at the report, it sort of seems like you and Mr. Shin agree that things are broken. Specifically, what is your biggest concern with the structure? What is a structural problem? Where is this break? Where is this crack? Where would you start trying to repair it?
I think one of the biggest structural problems is how unfair the system is. We talk about this a lot in the report, but we're requiring more of the people who have less ability to pay. And so until we start to tackle that and to really take that on, nothing's going to change. Our tax system is going to continue to be unfair, to be unjust. So I think that's one of the most important places to start.
Okay. Thank you so much. Senator Montgomery, we'll go to you next. First, feel free to say whether you agree or disagree that the budget is broken, but generally speaking, what is your biggest concern in terms of the structure of the state budget of Oklahoma?
I think my biggest concern ultimately, and this comes back to when I was first elected ultimately, just right at our latest oil bust. And my biggest concern more than anything is the volatility of a lot of our revenue sources that we have. And it's not just gross production tax, it's also income taxes, it's also corporate income taxes, these kinds of major revenue sources that we have that are extremely volatile. If you think about like just kind of a regular family that, if they're not consistently having a job, the income is not consistent, how do you pay for stuff that you need to pay for, right? When you don't know what kind of revenue or what kind of income you're going to have for the next month. And so that to me gets back to kind of the biggest, issue that I see is volatility, and how do you address that long term, structurally as well as in the short term. Obviously we put aside a lot of cash, for near term use to try to offset that. But, I'm not so sure that even that's necessarily the best thing if you don't put it in a lockbox, and it's really bizarre to me when you think of, even a few years ago, we had the rainy day fund. We had several $100 million in it. And if you guys don't know, you can actually drain the rainy day fund completely without actually using the proper constitutional process, as long as you pay it back by the end of the year. And it works out, and it's a gamble when we do it, but that is not good business in my opinion. So, that to me is one of my biggest challenges with when I look at the budget, is really just the volatility of it.
Thank you, Senator, very much. Last but not least, Chief Hoskin, your take on the structure of the Oklahoma State budget and your biggest concern related to that.
Well, the budget structure is broke. So I think we have perhaps unanimity up here on that. And some of the flaws in it have been mentioned, basing so much of the revenues on the price of oil and the absurd notion that you can cut taxes with a simple majority, but you can't fix those mistakes. That's been mentioned. A budget reflects the values of the society in which it's crafted. I can tell you that from my perspective, the Oklahoma budget is structured as a every man for himself budget. That good luck. If you have yours, you got it. And if you don't, then you're on your own. And that's not, in my view, how you build a great society. Cherokee society has not been built on that. We find that there's things that are in our collective interest to invest in, and we do that, and I think our budget reflects that. Just think about the tax cuts in this last session. We don't even get to the tax cuts that crippled the state budget when it came to education, infrastructure, and other investments 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Just look at last session and look at one revenue stream that is of top of mind for me, which is the gaming revenue that's put into the state. That's about $167 million this year. That was a record. The tax cuts last session are twice that. And yet I heard the governor of the state of Oklahoma hollering with some hysterics that the tribes ought to be paying more. if the discussion was, let's all pitch in on a budget that make sure it's not every man for himself, that the least among us have a robust safety net and those in the middle have a chance to move up, and that's not what Oklahoma's budget does right now, that would be a conversation, but that's not really what the conversation is about often. It's about where we can shift some of the revenue burden when we're lifting it for those who are doing well. And I think that's a problem in this state. And I think it's a problem in many places in this country. And I think if we fixed it, we'd have a stronger society, and that ought to be our goal. And again, our budgets ought to reflect the values of the society we live in. I just can't believe that the state I live in really holds these values. And if you look at what the people did on Medicaid expansion, I think it's true what I just said, that I can't believe it, because when you ask the voters what they want to do, the last time we asked them, they said the least among us ought to have access to health care, and we ought to all share in that. And that, to me, is what Oklahoma ought to be about. That ought to reflect some of our values. So we have some problems. They're fixable. I think oftentimes if we listen to the voters and followed their lead, we could fix it.
Thank you very much, Chief Hoskin. You led decently well into my next question. I'm just going to go down the line to Ms. Morris first, and then everybody else can, in the same order, kind of respond. The value of government has almost become a partisan debate across the country, and particularly here in Oklahoma. You have people who want a great deal more government and want more investment in things that might grow the footprint and responsibilities of government. And then you have people who want to drown it in the crick, I guess would be if here we are at the National Cowboy Museum versus a bathtub. But Ms. Morris, particularly when you're speaking to Republican legislators and elected officials, because they dominate the current landscape in Oklahoma, how do you attempt to move past any philosophical dynamic difference?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that's a great question because it is a problem in Oklahoma sometimes. So I think there's already cross-party collaboration going on on some issues. And so if we look at those as examples, we can think about what can we learn from it. The first example that comes to mind for me is infrastructure, right? I think most people would say that. We all see the roads that we drive on, the bridges that we cross. As in Oklahoma, we spend a higher portion of our dollars on things like transportation than a lot of other states do. So, both parties have prioritized that. Another example is the waiting list for people with developmental disabilities. In the last few years, in particular, there's been a pretty significant interest and passion on both sides of the aisle for addressing that problem, making sure Oklahomans can get the care that they need. So if we look at those two issues, I think what we can learn from them about, bridging the ideological gap is that when you can humanize what government does in our lives, whenever we can talk about how government manifests in our lives every day and the lives of our neighbors and our friends, I think that is sort of the first step in bridging that gap. Another thing that I often think about is I think sometimes there is a vocal minority, particularly at the Capitol. And so sometimes that vocal minority gets maybe more coverage than others who might not be as vocal. So one example of that, I think, is public schools. There's, as you're talking specifically about the Republican Party, I think there's some at the Capitol who maybe don't prioritize and fully support public schools. I don't think that's representative of the Republican Party in general, and I don't think that's representative of Oklahomans. And so I think naming that and finding those issues where we probably agree on more than we disagree on is the place to start. Whenever we can get past the talking points and actually talk about the people, I think that's where we make the progress.
Thank you so much. That's an interesting point you make. I always try to give at parties. I'm really a lot of laughs. I ask people, true or false, the majority of teachers in the state of Oklahoma are registered Republicans, and they are. And so people are often surprised by that, to your point. Same question to you, Senator Montgomery, as a Republican legislator. How do you hold true to sort of the base of your party values and beliefs while also recognizing the role that government does play? I don't believe you're the sort of person who believes it needs to be so small that it's inefficient or ineffective, right?
Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, we all want government to serve people, serve the public, and do it in a customer-friendly way, quite frankly. You'd be really kind of shocked at some of the instances that you hear government not serving people with kind of this customer service oriented, deal. And the governor's kind of been big on that. And some people kind of knock him for it or whatever, but I think that it is important, especially for my constituents, some of the stories I've heard, but that's a piece of it. But also, there's things that are not necessarily mutually exclusive to, I fundamentally believe we've got to fund education. We've got to do it better, and we've got to fund it better, but also, we have to ensure that the revenue that they're getting is going to be stable. Some of these stories from, years past when you have the gross production tax revenue that goes directly to them. You're cutting it in March of the fiscal year that they're in, and it's $18 million. Well, $18 million over a 3-month period is massive. I mean, it's basically equivalent to, slashing, a much higher amount for the remainder. So, things obviously that goes back to the stability issue, but also, there's not a mutual exclusivity in the sense of, funding education shouldn't come at the cost of everything else as well. And frankly, I think we have to have a discussion about some of the other things that we're having to spend money on. We talk about Medicaid expansions. It works out for people, for a lot of folks. I had a lot of constituents that were very supportive of that as well. But at the end of the day, it adds, at least several $100 million to, what we have to pay for. And that's on top of what we've had to pay, fund Medicaid at a higher rate over the last decade or so. So to me, and especially, we've got to get a grip on healthcare costs in this country. I mean, it's nobody would argue that we don't want good quality healthcare, because America definitely spends enough to be good quality healthcare, and yet outcomes are down where they are. We're spending at least twice as much as pretty much the next country, per person. So when I have to put more money into healthcare, that's every dollar I put there. That's a dollar I don't have for education. It's a dollar I don't have for roads and bridges. It's a dollar I don't have for basic regulatory functions. That has to be, something that we have to eyeball quite, and work on, frankly.
Real quick follow-up to you. As a Republican, is somebody maybe who's not a Republican or even is maybe, identifies as progressive, they come to your office, they're one of your constituents, they want to talk to you about an issue. What advice do you have? How do they speak your language, and how do they avoid maybe, are there any buzzwords that, once you get down that road, you're like, I don't know that, that helps us, prevents us from finding common ground? What advice would you have to somebody?
I take a little different approach in the sense of if you come to me genuinely and want to have a discussion, I'm going to try to meet you midway. That's my attitude towards it. If if you're going to come in and be really aggressive and just, you got to do this and use profanity. And I had a really interesting voicemail the other day to that effect. And it's, it's interesting because I'm not the one who first hears that. It's my assistant that hears that first. That doesn't resonate with people at the end of the day. So if you come in, you're genuine, you want to talk about something, you want to talk about an issue or an idea, I think it's the legislator's job to try to meet you halfway on how to better that, or how to, better that idea and try to make it happen. But also at the same time, and there are things that just, we know politically probably won't fly necessarily. So, but I don't want to say that just because we think something won't fly politically doesn't mean that we shouldn't try on some things. I've been really amazed, honestly, at the number of times that I've said that'll never happen, and then we turn around and did it. There are things that I do feel confident about. Just having a sense of things now, but at the same time, like tax increases, I didn't really in my wildest dreams think that we were actually going to pass tax increases, but we did. And so. There's things that you, at the end of the day, you just can't say, that'll never happen to. I think that's part of it. So
there you go. In my business, it's never believe something's true until you hear someone deny it. So, okay. Chief Hoskin, same general question to you. You represent a variety of people with a variety of political beliefs and views and philosophical differences. What advice can you give for us in terms of talking to people who maybe start from a different perspective than you do?
Well, Cherokees are Oklahomans and they're Americans, so that means they have a lot of different political beliefs, party alignments. We don't have parties in the Cherokee Nation. I'm often very thankful for that. But when we're talking to each other as Cherokees about what we expect out of government, we expect government to support the citizens. So when we talk about supporting the citizens in the form of making sure healthcare is accessible to every Cherokee, that's something universally Cherokees think ought to happen. They have high expectation. The same is true with respect to job training. You know, parents want their kids to compete and win in the economy, but they want them to have a chance to compete and win. And that means access to job training and education, that sort of thing. People want good roads, and they want to make sure that their little town isn't forgotten about in the economy. And that happens a lot in Oklahoma. It's one of the reasons that rural Oklahoma has taken it on the chin for so long, because there's not been the investment that needs to be made. So on the individual level, it's a discussion in which there is a broad agreement among Cherokees. When you're talking about it in terms of investment, my father was in the legislature for 12 years. By the way, we're talking about Democrats and Republicans. Last I checked, our labor commissioner, who just gave a wonderful speech, is a Republican, served with my father in the legislature. My father would talk to his constituents about some of these things. Education, he was a teacher. We shouldn't be 10 years into cutting and gutting public education, he'd say, and people would agree with him. Now, he would get hit every 2 years with, he's a tax and spend liberal. My dad's pretty progressive gentleman, a tough gentleman. In fact, your speech kind of sounded like him. That's a compliment, by the way. But, you know, in terms of the politics that drive us every 2 years, it's really easy to attack somebody who just espoused the same beliefs and recommendations that I did as a tax and spend liberal. What we need to talk about are the cost in society. I mean, the Medicaid discussion is a good one. We ought to have a really robust debate about it. I would suggest that a good discussion about Medicaid isn't so much how much it's going to cost us. That's in a vacuum. But what it cost us when people weren't insured. I mean, that's the kind of conversation that Oklahomans have, and they end up supporting Medicaid because it wouldn't have passed if Republicans hadn't voted for it. The cost of healthcare in this country is a big problem. It's not being driven, I submit, by helping those who are uninsured. It's being driven by a lot of other factors. We ought to have that discussion. That discussion can happen in a really nonpartisan way. It comes down to fairness. It comes down to whether we all are in this together. I think when you talk in those terms, it gets me back to when my father was talking to his constituents about education. There was broad agreement. There was a lot of nodding heads about what we expect out of our public schools and the fact that it ought to cost a little more. And they need to get hit with the mailer every 2 years. Thankfully, he survived every election he had, but not everybody does. And that comes at a cost, I think, in terms of public debate.
Thank you so much, Chief. Dr. Rogers, same question to you. As you talk to people who maybe have a different perspective than yourself, how do you try to make that conversation productive and fruitful?
Thank you for the political question. So I tell my students, I teach public finance this semester, so yay. And I tell them that, you know, economics is pretty straightforward. You can do the cost benefit, you can see what programs are effective, you can see your bang for your buck. But politics, that's really hard. Getting, you know, knowing how a program will work, what investment in education will get you, the big bang you get for pre-K education. I think we had that figured out in this state for a very brief shining moment, and then we kind of lost it. But there was a time when we were a leading state in pre-K spending, and that's shown to have lasting return on investment. So I think as an economist, I try to flip I don't want to talk politics. Let's talk return on investment. It's not spending, it's an investment. And what do we get for this investment? Yes, you have to spend it now, and it will pay off down the road. I think we could talk about that when it comes to Medicaid and Medicare and the expansion and spending on healthcare. You spend money, but then people are working, they're healthier, they don't stress out your medical facilities, your mental health facilities. They have more highly functioning families. Kids aren't traumatized as much. All those sorts of outcomes are costly in the long run. So I think if somehow we could all be like economists and take off our political hats. I don't have to get elected for anything, so that's easy for me to say, whatever, I'm not running. And if we could just think of these as investments and what's the return on investment. I think if we could flip the switch that way, maybe we could put aside a little bit of the politics and whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or something else. I think we can all agree that you want to invest in things that have payoffs for the state as a whole. And I mean, it's easy for small groups to say, hey, this is good for me, you should support it. It's a little harder to show that you have broader returns to the state as a whole. So that's sort of I try to find, let's talk about cost benefit analysis, which hardly anybody wants to talk about, except for the people at OK Policy. You guys like to talk about that.
There you go. Thank you. So it sounds like you have a briefcase full of data that you can just hand out. Thank you, Dr. Rogers. I've got two more main questions, and then if I need to wrap it up or go longer, I can do that. Senator Montgomery, this one starts with you, and we'll go around the room as well. You mentioned as a Republican legislator, you voted in favor of the 2018 historic tax revenue increasing tax package. And then 3 years later, you voted in favor of the tax cuts on the corporate income tax and the personal income tax this last session. Typically, you and many of your constituents, certainly the ones that probably voted for you, are generally opposed to raising taxes except in the most serious of circumstances. So as you look at the state's needs, and they were discussed by Mr. Shin a little bit, we talk about mental health treatment and education and infrastructure, what do you consider to be the best way to generate new revenue moving forward?
You know, I think one of the things that we have to look at is, and even during the walkout, there was a lot of folks that were like, let's raise the income tax, and this is after we had already passed the tax increases as it was. Let's vote on a tax increase. And, I kind of had to redirect them to the point of, well, we can also talk about, standard deductions, itemized deductions again. We had already done the itemized deduction deal at that point, but, I think those are fair conversations on some level, and it's only a 51 vote, right, for the legislature. So there's ways to legitimately, legally work around a discussion on rates, right? So like gross production tax, we got rid of one of the incentives that was there that offsets that revenue directly, never mind, the actual rate increase on GPT. Getting rid of the incentives was almost just as powerful as increasing the rate. And so, when you talk about, kind of those kinds of things there, I think that's a fair discussion to have as to what kind of incentives we offer for different things. And then especially for existing deals that are out there, we have to look at are they working or not. And of course, even the new stuff, it has to be truly new. It can't be some kind of existing industry that's already been here. We're just throwing them an incentive, like the film thing, in my mind, is actually a good example. The new deal that we have is actually better than the old deal that we had, right? The old deal was kind of more, we had done the study. We've seen that it didn't work. It's not effective at actually retaining and creating and keeping jobs here. I'm optimistic about the new deal that we have. It's more targeted and focused on creating, keeping videographers, cinematographers, and all the things that go along with creating production and keeping jobs permanently here. So, it's kind of a balance, right? So not only do you have to look at, are the incentives good or are they quality? But also at the same time, are these incentives actually creating, we want to foster economic growth and development as well, because we create taxpayers that way, right? If we create the jobs, they're paying taxes and that kind of thing. So, and for me as well, there's an issue of revenue volatility. I don't really, we can play around with the tax code and the structure and everything else, but until we get the volatility issues sorted out, I think that's a huge aspect. To me, creating a revenue source that's actually permanent and actually does beat inflation, because that seems to be one of the chief concerns, is keeping up with inflation as well, like by way of creating permanent trusts, right? The city of Oklahoma City, as part of their MAPS 4 program, they created a permanent trust to fund mental health services in their city. They created a trust to do that. That's money that's going to beat inflation, because that's how investments work. The idea is to beat inflation and to grow over time. The commissioners of the Land Commission That works out really well for public education. It's money that beats inflation as well, as opposed to kind of this kind of hem-hawing and fighting around, what the tax rate is, right? There are other ways to create revenue in a permanent way that funds the things that we want as well. So.
Thank you, Senator. I might come back to you in a second, depending on time. I'm going to go out of order real quick. Dr. Rogers, you served on the Incentive Evaluation Commission. Are you still on that?
No,
Okay,
I stayed a little over my term until I was replaced.
I'm sure you're heartbroken. But as somebody who's studied incentives and tax credits and things like that in the state of Oklahoma, Mr. Shin, talked about in the report, it suggests different tax credits and exemptions that, are worth or could be ended as a way to increase revenue without, a 76 vote bill in the legislature to raise a tax. Are there any of those tax credits, incentives, things like that you would be in favor of, or you would recommend particularly in sunsetting or eliminating?
Well, I'm going to deflect from that particular question and give my pitch that I gave.
I thought you didn't run for office. I thought you
for the. Well, no, this is important since I have the appropriate audience here. So, the Incentive Evaluation Commission is actually a remarkable feat by the state of Oklahoma to create that and be, I do sound like I'm running for office, to be a kind of a leading state in committing to evaluate incentives. And I participated in that for 5 years, and I was very happy to do so. But here's the thing, and I think this is the flaw, without even looking at particular incentives. By the way, we said let the film tax credit sunset. That was our recommendation. It was one of the few that was actually unanimous, but okay, that's another
I was
story.
there. There was drama over it.
There was drama.
They didn't say that, but
there were tears. It was
team.
whatever. But that's okay. So here's the thing, the flaw with our incentives. And it's that it's not even that any particular incentive might be good or bad, but a company could get 3, 4, 5 different incentives, and we try to evaluate like the quality jobs program as if they're not getting these other incentives. If you're in the aerospace industry in this state, you get lots of incentives from a lot of different programs. And we don't really have, and I pushed and pushed as much as I could as one commission member, that what we really need to do is, so there's this layering, you could be getting lots of different incentives. So how do you know if Quality Jobs is doing something, or maybe it's this tax credit, or you simply can't evaluate them the way we do. So holistically, I think incentives can be targeted, they can be effective. But what we have is a bunch of industries that know how to get incentives. And so they go and they know how to take advantage of these. It doesn't necessarily change your behavior. It doesn't necessarily serve the interests of the states. And my proposal was limit how much a particular industry could get, however you want to put a limit on it, and let them pick what program is most effective for them. And then as legislators, you don't really have to know. They will tell you, because they will say, I want to tap into the quality jobs, or I want to tap into this or that one. Instead of letting a company get 5 or 6 or whatever adding up, or incentivizing employment for our utilities, that's a head scratcher for me. Because it seems to me that utilities should be about providing quality service at a lower cost and not an employment program. Okay, I don't know, this is how it works. So we spent a lot of time talking about the quality capital gains tax deduction. Is that a tax policy? Is it an incentive? It's always promoted as an incentive. That's a way I could never actually figure out how that was used. So
that makes 2 of us, but I tried.
I did try to, except that that's targeted, and it's not clear that that leads to reinvestment in the state at all. So I got off on a tangent. I don't remember your initial. I just wanted to answer a different question.
Sure.
We shouldn't layer them. We could have a buffet, and we should let companies pick which one is meaningful to them, And then that takes the onus off of legislators to figure out what works. They will tell you. They will tell you which ones matter to them.
That's interesting. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rogers. If the Thunder tank, does that still count as quality jobs? I can't figure it out. Mike Muscala gets his salary paid for. Okay. Chief Hoskin, back to you on the same kind of question. Are there any incentives that you think are really valuable in the state of Oklahoma? Any that you kind of question? What is the best way for the state to pursue new revenue? I'm guessing it's not an increase in the exclusivity fee.
Well,
Sorry, I couldn't help myself.
You couldn't help yourself. First of all, I think there's something to this buffet approach. If we called it the Golden Corral approach, I think it'd be wildly popular. But
I think we could collaborate on that.
could do that.
How it is.
But not all tax credits are created equal, and I think we need to objectively take a look at them and see if they generate what they're supposed to. The film tax credit, I agree with the senator. The old one wasn't working. The new one we supported. We think it will work. Let's see if it will work. I will say this: at the end of the day, if incentives, to the extent incentives are about attracting capital investment to Oklahoma and creating new jobs in Oklahoma, I've been involved in a lot of meetings with companies that want to come here. And it is true that the companies that we compete with or compete for, sometimes there is a difference maker on some of these credits or incentives. But what we ought to be concerned about are the industries that completely pass us over, because they look at us as a state that is not a top 10 state, but a bottom 10 state in public education, and that we've starved higher education even more than we've starved public education. And I think there's a lot of companies that look at that and they fly right over us, and it shouldn't be. If we want to be a top 10 state, then we need to have robust investment in those things that are public goods, and public education is one of those. Higher education is certainly one. Job training, which has exceeded what public and higher education has gotten because it's increased overall in the last 2 decades. But that ought to be a bigger part of the discussion, is what does our tax structure look like, and what are we not investing in, and what are we missing out on? And we're using these tax incentives to create a few jobs here and there, not as effective as a fair tax structure and one that invests in things that will really attract investment. Because I've not heard any companies tell me that they're interested in particular in what the tax rate is on oil rigs. But I have had them ask me if there's good ambulance service in this community, or if the hospital that shut down a year ago, what have we done? Or why public education in this state is so far in the cellar. Those questions come up, and then they don't spend very much time here, which means we miss out on a lot of jobs.
Thank you very much, Chief. Ms. Morris, in this question to you, let's talk specifically about the report and the suggestions regarding tax credits and potential ways to raise revenue that don't involve increasing a tax directly. What would you like to say about that? What would you recommend?
So every year, state agencies have to submit budget requests, right? We don't reevaluate tax incentives every year. I think that opens us up to unknowns. There are several tax incentives that have increased several times, have immensely increased since they were introduced. So if we don't actively look at those and determine whether or not they have achieved what the hope was, then we're missing out on a good opportunity to raise some of that revenue. One of the things we talk about in the report, it's been mentioned a few times, is the capital gains deduction. It cost the state $127 million in 2020, primarily benefited people making more than $200,000 annually. And frankly, it hasn't worked. It hasn't increased capital investment in Oklahoma. So that is one of the big ones that we talk about in the report. When we talk about incentives, it's an opportunity to talk about what we're prioritizing in Oklahoma. For a similar or smaller price tag, we could significantly expand tax credits that help low-income Oklahomans. Something like, expanding the sales tax relief credit, which is a credit meant to offset the cost of groceries, would go a long way towards helping low-income Oklahomans that need it the most. So far in Oklahoma, we have prioritized things like the capital gains deduction. I think this is a good time to rethink what we've been prioritizing and think about how we can use incentives and expenditures to really help the Oklahomans who need it most.
Thank you so much. My final question, I think, unless we want to keep going, I'll start with you, Chief Hoskin. It's sort of awkward that I'm here above you, but you talked about, needing state revenue to make targeted investments to attract businesses and do the things we've discussed. The Oklahoma Tax Commission has received and at this point denied many appeals of paid and pending tax bills based on the argument that existing legal precedent says tribal citizens who live and work on Indian country reservations are not subject to the taxation authority of the state and subdivisions. I wanted to ask you, do you believe that the state of Oklahoma has the legal authority to tax tribal citizens who live and work on their reservation?
Thank you all. I think you were good. No, that is a good question. There's nothing new about the law out there on the ability of a state to tax a member of a federally recognized tribe on a reservation. What's new, of course, is the scope of the reservation under the McGirt case. So we can look to existing law and we can see that taxation doesn't attach to individual Native Americans who live on reservations. Now, this is something that's going to have to develop in the state of Oklahoma, but I will tell you this. That doesn't mean that the Cherokee Nation or the chief of the Cherokee Nation thinks that we don't still all have a stake in the state's investments. And so, tax issues have been raised before in the context of Indian tribes, the tobacco tax cases in the 80s and the 90s. How were they resolved? They were resolved ultimately through agreement in which we share revenue. Vehicle licensing, tags, that dispute was resolved by Cherokee Nation through a compact that actually gives public schools and public safety and infrastructure more money than it would get if we didn't issue tags and sued each other into oblivion. So these issues of taxation on reservations can be resolved. The question is going to be, do we share a philosophy between the tribes and the state that on some things we are all in it together? And I meant it when I said it when the governor was attacking the gaming compact, talking about all the revenue that we generate and the contributions that we make on top of that. And I said that it was in the public's interest that we continue to do that and not terminate the compact. The same is true for any revenue that might be in question, and it could be personal income tax when it comes to our reservations. We all still drive on the same roads. It still matters whether the public school that your child goes to is the best that it can be. It matters whether people have access to health care. It matters whether we invest in higher education and public education. And we all pay a tax when we don't invest in those things. It's just a hidden tax. And I think if we have those conversations between the state and the tribes, we will work out solutions to any revenue gaps that are created. The solution might be so good that it's actually a better deal for communities like our car tag compact. So we've not seen this before because McGirt is new in some senses, but in another sense, we've been down this road before. And if we work cooperatively and identify those things that we all have a common interest in and commit to investing in it and then not be lopsided, then I think that the state of Oklahoma will be fine. Because look, the tribes have been here for the state and with the state. We're the best friends the state's ever had if we're treated with respect.
Thank you very much, Chief Hoskin. I'm going to go to the other elected official on the panel, Senator Montgomery. That question and the application of it, potentially the application of that existing legal precedent down the road, I think is something that has been discussed, privately, probably in the legislature. What can you say about that issue and whether there needs to be a more robust conversation about compacting on that topic, or the impact if those tribal citizens are able to not be subject to that taxation authority in Oklahoma?
Yeah. I don't think it's any secret that there's definitely been a shift in paradigm, I guess, recently on all of these issues, especially on taxation, of course, and it's especially of interest to the legislature on how taxation, and of course all the regulatory things that go along with it, but taxation is a big one, obviously, as it relates to the budget. I don't know. I would say that I think we would be interested in how do we work with the tribes on these issues. And continue to make sure that the state is providing services in those areas as well, because that's been a topic of conversation at times. I think there's a pretty compelling argument to be said. Why are we still funding, things in areas that if they're not going to be paying taxes on, services for those areas? And there are challenges like that, and we've already seen that issue in particular, especially at ODOT, in the Norman area. Where things kind of go awry there. And I think at the end of the day, cooler heads have to prevail on the issue, and there's a host of other unique facets to this as well, right? Like, we talk about itemized deductions. If you guys don't know, you can deduct gambling losses. Well, one of the things that was added to the cap that one of the things that's subject to that cap is gambling losses when we capped that a few years ago. But now we have folks that have been advocating for gambling losses to be not subject to that itemized cap. And so the state's then incurring the cost on income tax revenue when we lobby for, adding those kinds of things back in. So there are a host of issues here that are not just, tribal citizen, taxation, but also, other things that are outside of that as part of the relationship that we have with our tribes.
Thank you, Senator. Does anybody know the line on the Thursday night football? Okay, no. Dr. Rogers, same kind of topic, same question about, in this sort of situation that we're now looking at, the potential impact that I referenced. Any thoughts?
Well, I guess I don't really know a lot about the nuances of the, one jurisdiction taxing another. Instead, once again, I'd like to answer a different question. I think you asked this before, but I got skipped.
I think you're being drafted to run for our Congress. There you go.
There we go. I'm working on it. And I think, we had this come up before. There's the focus on the rate, but there's also the focus. What we could do is focus on the tax base. What is taxable income? And this links up with incentives, tax credits. So this is just revenue we don't collect, and our income taxes and other corporate income taxes as well. And, the rule of thumb, economics is easy, I'm telling you folks, just study economics. Low rate, broad base. It's fair. You don't have to pick winners. You're not like rewarding some. You get rid of the lobbyists trying to do something. And we don't have a low rate, broad-based system in our state. So I guess if I could go back to the first question you asked me, I was like, sales taxes could be broadened to include services. That would raise more revenue on the same existing tax that we have. It also would arguably be less regressive. Income taxes, the sorts of deductions and tax credits and things, those could go away or be reduced. And that would mean that we would raise more revenue with the same existing rates, do a little less picking favorites or everybody, getting their bit. So, and I guess in terms of the original question you did ask about, whether we're taxing different groups or not, and what the arrangement is, that's really a base question, right? Are their incomes included in the base? So, it's the base that we could be addressing within the confines of, limitations on tax rate increases. And maybe that's where we can make some political hay right there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers. Ms. Morris, I'll end that question, or I'll come to you with that question. I like the way Dr. Rogers framed it. It could affect the base. Any thoughts about that, what the impact could be, or what, as Chief Hoskins suggested, maybe there's agreements to avoid any major changes like that?
So I will definitely defer to the chief on, a lot of this. I'm not an expert on the implications of McGirt. I think a lot of us in the room have a lot to learn about what McGirt means for the state. But yeah, I think that, local, state, and tribal leaders will be able to work together to figure out how we can make sure that everyone is taxed fairly, that we still have the services that we all need. And so I think that's where to start. And then I will be willing and ready to learn much more about what McGirt means for the state.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Chief, I want to give you a chance to, if you wanted to respond to anything else that was said, or if you thought of something brilliant while everybody else was talking, anything you want to add?
I left all the brilliance that I had earlier.
There you go. I never had any. So,
But I will say that this is an issue that we're all going to have to become knowledgeable about and reconcile with our shared values. Like I started out, we all have some values that we want to see met in the form of investment. And if we're honest and forthright about that, then we have to acknowledge that we have to share the burdens of that. And Cherokee Nation's never shied away from sharing those burdens because we're the folks that stepped in when the state retreated from things like public education. So I think the people of the state have a great deal of confidence when whoever is chief of the Cherokee Nation or the tribes say that we're committed to making sure that those investments stay up, because we've put our money where our mouth is many times.
well, I appreciate you being willing to talk about it because, as you noted, it is something that we will hear more about, I think, at some point. That concludes the main 4 questions I had for everybody. Dave, we want to just, we're done. We got to go to lunch. Okay, great. I apparently took all the air out of the room. I want to turn it, I don't even know what I do now. I turn it back over to Ms. Rose, and I just want a round of applause real quick for our panelists. Thank you so much for having forthright conversations. I knew 3 of you before this. I have always found you to be open and ready to have the tough conversations. I appreciate it. I appreciate the Oklahoma Policy Institute for giving us a chance to have those conversations. And yeah, with that, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Okay, so Trace left his phone here too, so I'm gonna quickly scroll through all of his texts telling him to get a haircut. Sorry. Thank you, Trace. You did a wonderful job in moderating, and we really appreciate your questions and your authenticity that you always bring, including your jokes. If you all have not listened to the Non-Doc podcast, and I guess I am plugging, it is truly one of the funniest things that I listen to when they put them out. Interesting topics, always. And I also want to extend my sincere thanks to our panel. Having a candid conversation can be incredibly challenging, but it was our goal to bring forward a group of folks that could discuss challenging topics, not agree or perhaps agree with one another, and create a continued roadmap for us to talk about things over the next 2, 3, 5 years, because we know it's going to be a long-term solution for our state. So thank you very, very much. Please join me again in thanking our panel. I also want to thank those of you that are watching us remotely, including my mom. Hi, if you're still watching. You will be able to find a copy of the paper on our website, which is okpolicy.org/a better path forward. On that page, you'll find links to not only the paper, but the executive summary and the supporting documentation that we used in the report. You'll also find a link to today's video in case you didn't get enough watching it the first time and you want to watch it again and again. Again, one more time, that's okpolicy.org/a better path forward. Before we leave, a real quick, again, personal thanks to our donors and our supporters. Without you, we could not produce the report that we're talking about today or be able to hold the event. So thank you so much for your continued trust and investment in OK Policy. And with that, Dona Dogo Ai, until we meet again. Thank you.